The Daily Life of the Aztecs on the Eve of the Spanish Conquest. Chapter 2. Society and State at the beginning of the 16th century. The ruling class, dignitaries, warriors, officials, priests, the Mexican nobility, the rising class of traders, the monopoly of foreign trade, origin of the honors allowed to the merchant guilds, the trader's place in the social system, the craftsmen, the common people, rights and duties of the ordinary citizen, the possibilities open to him, the case of the landless peasant, the slaves, the misleading nature of the word, how a man became a slave, manumission, wealth and poverty, standards of living, ownership and usufruct of land, personal estate, taxes and tribute, wealth and expenditure of the rulers, public service and private fortune, luxury, comfort, and frugality, the sovereign, the great dignitaries, the council, beginnings of the Mexican dynasty, election of the emperor, the prerogatives and functions of the Cihuacuat, other great dignitaries and high officials, the Tlatocan, or Supreme Council. During its migration and after its arrival in the Central Valley, the Mexican tribe retained a fairly simple and essentially equalitarian social structure. The Mexica, a people of soldier peasants, sometimes stayed for several years in fertile places. Sometimes they fought to gain possession of arable land, and then, carrying their few belongings on their backs, they would begin their march again. Such a life did not call for any marked differentiation in social function, nor for the appearance of an organized authority. The head of each family was both a warrior and a farmer, and he joined with all the others in the palavers which made the important decisions. And as for the Aztecs' standard of living, it was the same for all. They were all equally poor. The only germ of a ruling class that existed at this period was to be found in the priests of Huitzilopochtli, the god-bearers, who joined some degree of military command and general authority to their priestly functions. But this rudimentary organization was sufficient, and when the Mexicans, in an attempt to imitate their more developed neighbors and to raise themselves to the rank of the cities, provided their nation with a king, the result was catastrophic. At the time of the foundation of their city, they had the same social and political organization as that which they had known throughout their wanderings. How great a change there was between this and the beginning of the 16th century! The Mexican community had become differentiated, complex, and stratified. The different sections had widely differing functions, and the authority of the ruling dignitaries was very great. The priesthood, high in honor and importance, no longer had its military and civil aspect. Trade now dealt with a great volume of valuable merchandise, and the influence of the traders was increasing. Wealth and luxury had made their appearance, and misery with them. The old simple lines of tribal organization had been overlaid by those of a state, with its ability to administer and to conceive and execute a foreign policy. And at the head of this stood a single man, the Tlatoani, the emperor, with his counselors and his officials about him, a man so high and splendid that the common people might not look upon him. The change was very great, and it had come about in a very short time. Tribal democracy had been replaced by an aristocratic and imperialistic monarchy. The ruling class. The ruling class, the top level of the social stratification, was itself divided into several categories according to function, importance, and standing. Thus a high priest was the equal of a general, but both would look down upon a poor parish priest or a village tax gatherer. Yet all of them stood apart from what Spaniards called the plebeians. The Masewaltin in the singular, who had neither authority nor office. The word tacutli, dignitary or lord, was applied to the upper level of the ruling class when the army, administration, or judiciary was concerned. It was used for the chief generals, officials of the highest rank in Mexico, the head of the exchequer, for example, and in the provinces, the chiefs of the districts of the capital, and the judges who dealt with the most important cases in the large towns. If the former ruler of a city that had been absorbed by the empire remained in his place under the authority of Tenochtitlan, he was a tecutli. The emperor himself was a tecutli, and the glorious title was often borne by the gods. Mictlantecutli, the lord of the world that is under the ground, for example, or Xiuhtecutli, the turquoise lord, the god of fire. The priests, for their part, were only rarely distinguished in this way. As we shall see, they had their own hierarchy, which was no less splendid and respected than that of the other divisions. In the early days, the Tecutli was elected, or rather nominated, seeing that the choice of the electors nearly always fell on a member of the same family for any given appointment. The succession to the headship of a district, for example, came not about by inheritance, but at his death, by the election of the most honorable, wise, capable, and aged man. If the dead man has left a son who is fit for the position, he is chosen. It is always a relation who is elected, providing that there is one, and that he is suited for the post. By the time of Moctezuma II, however, the only offices that were really filled by election were the very highest, those of the emperor and of the 4 senators who attended him. In all other cases, it was either a straightforward appointment of his own servant by the emperor, or a nomination on the part of the districts or the cities, a nomination which held good only if it were confirmed by the central authority. In practice, it was generally a son or a nephew, or even a brother of the local Tecutli, who succeeded him in his village, town, or district. But although the outward show of tradition was respected, in fact, this was no longer an election but a presentation, and in the last resort, it was the emperor who appointed the man of his choice. Power no longer came from below, but from above. The new machine of the state had absorbed the last traces of the democratic beginnings. A Tecutli was always a man of importance, whether he governed a village, a town, or a city. It was the Tecutli whom the Spaniards, bringing with them a Jamaican word, termed the cacique. He had distinguishing clothes and jewels. His name carried the respectful termination, tzin. He lived in a tecali, a place modest or luxurious as the case might be, maintained by the people of the village or the town, who owed him wood and water, as the expression went, and domestic service. Land was set aside for him and worked on his account. The income from it, which he received, might be called his salary. Apart from this, the emperor allowed him victuals and prey, stuff, clothes, and provisions, in return for which he was obliged to present himself before the emperor whenever he was called for. What were his functions? In the first place, he represented his people before the higher authorities. He was to speak for the people under his care and to defend them, if it was necessary, against excessive taxation or any encroachment upon their land. Secondly, he judged lawsuits, appeal lying to Mexico or Texcoco. Then, as a military commander, he led the contingents that he was required to furnish in war. Finally, he was there to maintain order, to oversee the cultivation of the fields, particularly those which were set aside to produce the tribute, and to see that this tribute was paid to the capisque of the imperial administration. To accomplish all this, especially if his district were important, he, in his turn, had the right of appointing local officials, so long as he paid them himself out of the produce of his lands and his allowances. The Tecutli, his family, and his children paid no taxes. There used to be a great difference, in the France of the earlier days, between the manner of life of the country, squires in Brittany or Gascony, and that of the great lords around the king, and a great difference in their real importance. In the same way, the Tecutli of a distant Mexican village was of no great account compared with one of those in Moctezuma's train. But whereas the French noble was sure of leaving his title to his descendants, the Tecutli was not. He only held it for himself and for his lifetime, and at his death, the double process of a local nomination and central confirmation might give his office to a distant relative, or even to someone entirely outside his family. And in fact, many cities, particularly those in the neighborhood of Mexico, had a Tecutli directly appointed by the emperor. Each district or capuli in the capital had its own chief, the capulec, who was elected for life, preferably from the same family, by the inhabitants, and confirmed by the emperor. He had a council of elders, the huehuetque, who were probably the oldest and best known heads of families, and he never did anything without taking the opinion of the elders. His duties in every way of life were those like the Tecutli of a village or city. He was particularly required to be able to protect and defend his fellow citizens. But his chief task was the keeping of the register of the communal land belonging to the capuli, which was shared out in parcels among the various families. As we shall see, each family had the usufruct in its place and could farm it out and take the harvest under certain conditions. The duty of the capulec and his council was to see that these conditions were respected, and to record all the alterations of the sharing of the land in their books by means of emblematic pictures and hieroglyphics. By reason of his office, the capulec had to meet quite heavy expenses. The frequent district councils met in his house, and he was expected to offer the elders food and drink. Even today, in a Mexican village, if an Indian who has an official position does not do the thing handsomely, he loses face. It was the same then. In comparison, the head of the district did not pay taxes, and the people of his capuli, taking it in turn, did the work of his land and of his house. There is no doubt here that we are in contact with a very old institution in the Mexican tribe. The capuli is the true nucleus, and the chief and elders represent the earliest form of the Aztec territorial organization. It is equally sure that at the time of which we are speaking of the capulec, although he was still a highly honored figure, found his authority growing less and less real as it was nibbled away on all sides. He was elected to his office by his fellow citizens, but he only retained it by the sovereign's favor. In theory, he was at the head of all local activities, but he had to yield the temple to the Guasuili, the district priests, who belonged to the ecclesiastical chain of command, and the house of the young men to the military instructors appointed from the above. Torquemada said that he was obliged to go to the palace every day to take his orders. He waited for the Huey Capisqui, who was the mayordomo mayor, to speak to him and tell him what the great lord the emperor ordered and commanded. There were officials under him whose duty it was to oversee groups of 20, 40, or 100 families for the payment of taxes and the organization of collective labor, such as cleaning or public works. At least theoretically they were under him, but one has a district impression that they really belonged to what one may call a bureaucratic administrative system which was outside his control. The number of civil servants, oficiales, that this nation had for every little thing was so great, and all the registers were so well kept, that there was nothing wanting in either the accounts or the rolls, padrones, for there were clerks and minor officials, mandoncillos, for everything, even the sweepers. The whole city and its districts were divided up, for the man who was in charge of 100 houses chose and appointed 5 or 6 other agents under him, and shared the 100 houses between them so that each, looking after 20 or 15, could direct and command the inhabitants in order to provide the taxes and the men necessary for the public works. And so the officials of the city, oficiales de la República, were so many in number that it was impossible to count them. This picture of Mexican officialdom, which is strangely reminiscent of the administrative system of the Inca Empire of Peru, leaves one little illusion as to the amount of independence that the capulec could enjoy, with the Huey Capisqui above him and the bureaucracy below. He was a traditional chief, a survivor from a former day, and he now found himself incongruously attached to a centralized administration which belonged not to the local communities, but to the state. Finally, although it may be conceded that at the beginning he had some military powers, they had almost all been taken away. In practice, the contingents from the various quarters were grouped in 4 corps, agreeing with the 4 great regions of the city: Teopan, Moyotlan, Aztacalco, and Cuepopan. And these corps were under the commanders far more imposing than the local chiefs. In a country that was perpetually at war, the army offered brave and ambitious men a career particularly rich in honors and power. It goes without saying that in Tenochtitlan, every man, whatever his origin, was either a warrior or wished to be one. The officials had been, or were going to become, warriors. The priests, at least when they were young, went off to war in order to take a prisoner, and some of them, the Tlamacasquetzaltecas, Tecuiacque were both priests and fighting men. As for the traders, as we shall see, their calling had none of the tameness that it has with us, but was more like an armed reconnaissance or a colonial expedition. A boy child was dedicated to war at his birth. His umbilical cord was buried together with a shield and some little arrows, and in a set speech he was told that he had come into this world to fight. The god of the young men was Tezcatlipoca, who was also called Yaot the warrior, and Telpochtli the youth, and it was Tezcatlipoca who ruled over the Telpochtli, the houses of the young men, where the boys went when they were 6 or 7. There was one in each district, and the education that they gave was essentially an education for the war in which the Mexican boy longed to shine. When they were 10, the boys had their hair cut with a lock left on the napes of their necks. The lock was called a piochli, and they were not allowed to cut it off until they had managed to make a prisoner in battle, even if it meant 2 or 3 joining their efforts to do so. The warrior who had accomplished this first exploit carried the title of Iyak from then onwards. "I am an Iyak," said Tezcatlipoca. So the young warrior already rivaled his god. He cut off his lock and let his hair grow so that it fell over his right ear. But he had still only risen a single rank, and if he did not do better in the 2 or 3 succeeding campaigns, he would be obliged to retire and give up soldiering. He would have to devote himself to his piece of land and his family, a dismal fate. He would never be allowed to wear dyed and embroidered clothes nor jewelry. He would only be a masewali. But if on the other hand he were favored by the gods, if, as a Mexican would have said, he had been born under a fortunate sign, he would go on as a fighting man. When he had taken or killed 4 of the enemy, he would have the title of tequila, one who has a share of the tribute. That is to say, he would reach that upper category of men who participated in the allotment of the revenues. He would become a commander, and he would join the councils of war. He would have the right to wear certain feather headdresses and bracelets made of leather. The higher ranks would be open to him, and he might become a guachik, a guachichimecat, chichimec eagle, or an otomit, so called from the old, rough, warlike tribe that lived in the mountains north of Mexico. Lastly, he might become a member of one of the 2 higher military orders, that of the Jaguar Knights, Tezcatlipoca's soldiers, who wore a skin of a jaguar in battle, and that of the Eagle Knights, whose helmet was an eagle's head, and who were soldiers of the sun. In the 11th month of the year, Ochpanitzli, the emperor himself, distributed the honors and rewards. They all stood in even ranks before Moctezuma, who was seized upon his eagle batting Guaupetlapan. Indeed, he sat upon eagle's feathers, and the back of his seat was jaguar skin. Everyone stood before him and saluted him. At his feet, he had all kinds of weapons and badges of distinction, shields, swords, cloaks, loincloths. They stood before him and saluted him, and each in turn received his gifts. Then they went aside to adorn themselves and put on their decorations. It was to the great chiefs that he, the emperor, gave these splendid ornaments. When they had all been equipped in this way, they formed their ranks again in front of Moctezuma, and the decorations that they had received were their rewards, and they served to bind them to the service. And the women who watched, the old women, the beloved women, shed burning tears, and their hearts were filled with sorrow. They said, "Here are our beloved children." And in 5 or 6 days the word water and burning is said, that is to say, war. Will they ever return? Will they ever find their way back? Indeed, they will be gone forever. But these lamentations, which were traditionally allowed, do not seem to have diverted the warriors from their no less traditionally honored and glorified career. For them, death in battle, or better still, death on the stone of sacrifice, was the promise of a happy eternity. For a warrior who was killed in the field or on the altar was sure of becoming one of the companions of the eagle, Cuauhteca, one of those who accompanied the sun from its rising to the zenith in a procession that blazed with light and was splendid with joy, and then of being reincarnated as a hummingbird, to live forever among the flowers. At the summit the military hierarchy merged with that of the state. One of the emperor's titles was Tlacatecutli, Lord of the Men, that is to say, of the warriors, and his primary function was that of commanding not only the Mexican armies, but those of the allied cities. The most important of the great dignitaries who were about him had offices that were essentially military, at least to begin with. In time of war, 4 of them commanded the contingents that were supplied by the 4 regions of the capital. Of these 4 great ones, 2 stand out by reason of the honors that they receive. The Tlacatecat, he who commands the warriors, and the Tlacochcalcat, pardon me for that, the man of the javelin house. The title seems to imply that the first had a military command, and that the second was responsible for the arsenals, Tlacochcali, in which the weapons were kept. Generally, they were near relations of the sovereign, and it was often from them that the emperor was chosen. Itzcoat, Ashayacat, Tizoc, and Moctezuma II were Tlacochcalcat at the time of their election, and Ahuitzot was Tlacatecat. They had a splendid and magnificent dress, embroidered cloaks, jewels, and plumes. Their houses and their way of life were based on the emperor's. They were among the first to receive when presents were given, and the spoil of subjected provinces shared out. They both had great standing and great wealth. This was also the case, according to their rank, with all the soldiers who distinguished themselves. As they rose in the hierarchy, their fame grew, and as they earned the right to wear more and more splendid ornaments and clothes, so at the time they received gifts in kind and the rents of various estates. They were not only free from the duty of farming their own shares of land, as ordinary men had to do, but they were given other shares, mostly in conquered country, which were worked for them. They were wealthy men, with their fine houses, many servants, brilliant clothes and jewels, well-filled storehouses and coffers. But it must be remembered that this was a wealth that came only after honorable achievements and as a consequence of them. A man was wealthy because he was honored, not honored because he was wealthy. Besides, honorable achievement was the only means to wealth for a man of the ruling class. The Spaniards believed these military chiefs to be a nobility that attended upon the emperor, the equivalent of the European nobles at the court of the King of Spain or of France. But they were clearly mistaken, for the court of the Aztec emperor was not made up of hereditary magnates with great estates or inherited wealth, but of military or civil officials who enjoyed privileges that were attached to their office. This ruling class continually renewed itself, taking recruits from the general body of the people, and this was its great strength. Any warrior who managed to capture his 4 prisoners became a tequilla, and thus a member of the upper classes, whatever his origin. Furthermore, the emperor filled the higher ranks by promotion according to merit, and often at the end of a battle or a war he would make a whole batch of superior officers. Moctezuma II made 260 at once after his victory over the men of Tutotepec. Tesosomoc states that all the plebeians who had distinguished themselves in the war against Coyoacan were promoted to the highest ranks after the submission of the city, and that at the same time each was given the income of 1 estate or more. Moreover, even those very important offices of Tlacochcalcat and Tlacatecat, which have already been mentioned, were so filled that one at least was held by a soldier who had risen from the ranks, criado en las guerras, as Sahagún has it. In a society that was so hungry for renown, a society in which renown based upon services rendered counted for so much to everybody, the remarkable exception of the businessmen will be dealt with later. The fighting men had an enviable and an envied position. When a father treated his son to one of those improving lectures that were so usual among the Aztecs, he always proposed them as the model for imitation. Their superiority was continually made evident, not only by their clothes and marks of rank, but by their privileges on ritual and ceremonial occasions. In the 8th month of the year, which was called Uwe Tequihuit, the high feast of the dignitaries, for example, only the captains and other brave men accustomed to the usages of war were allowed to join in the great sacred dance that took place at night, At the foot of the pyramids in the Holy City, by the light of huge braziers and torches held up by young men, they danced by pairs, and each pair of warriors was joined by a woman, one of the awianime, the companions of the unmarried soldiers, with her hair loose on her shoulders, dressed in a fringe-embroidered skirt. The dancers wore jewels according to their rank. A kwachik had the right to a lip ornament in the shape of a bird, and otomit to one shaped like the leaf of a water plant. They all wore turquoise discs in their ears. The dance went on for several hours, and sometimes the emperor came to take part in it. In the following month, Tlaxochimaco, there was an equally solemn dance in honor of Huitzilopochtli in front of his Teocalli, but this dance was at noon, for Huitzilopochtli was the god of the sun at its height. Here the warriors were arranged according to their rank. First, the Quaquachicting and the Otomi, then the Tequiwake, then the young men who had made one prisoner, then the elder brothers, the distinguished soldiers who acted as instructions, and lastly, the youths from the district schools. And they held hands, one woman between two men, and one man between two women, as in the dances of the common people in the old Castile. And as their dance went about, they sang. The most seasoned in war, who were in the first row, held their women by the waist, as if they were embracing them. But the others, less distinguished in military rank, were not allowed to go so far. There were many other occasions upon which the warriors were the center of the admiring public attention and honor. It was the case, for example, when every 4 years there was the celebration of the feast of the god of fire, and the emperor and his chief ministers, covered with ornaments of gems and feathers, danced the dance of one flower, or danced the dance of dignitaries, or on the days that had the sign Se Shochit, one flower, when the sovereign gave them rich presents, amid songs and dances, or of course, every time the victorious army came home from an expedition, making its entry into the city by one of the raised causeways, with welcoming elders and the din of Teponatzli, and the trumpets attending them as far out as the shore of the lake. If it is true that these dignitaries did not form a nobility in the European sense of the word, it is equally true that at the time of which we are speaking, there was an inclination to make distinctions hereditary, distinctions that were only attached to an office. The son of a Tekuli did not fall to the level of a Masawali, of a plebeian. By the right of his birth alone, he had the title of Bili, whose primary meaning is child or son, but which had acquired the sense of son of a Tekuli, or as the Spaniards would say of Hidalgo, son of somebody of importance. In theory, the Pili had no privileges, and in order to rise in the army, the administration, or in religion, he was to work as hard as any Masawali. In fact, he had many advantages from the beginning, derived from the standing of his father and a higher education in the Galmakak instead of the local school. It was among the Pili that the emperor most readily found his officials, judges, and ambassadors. And the Pili as a group may be placed halfway between the people and the ruling class, forming a reservoir that could be drawn upon to meet the constantly increasing needs of a constantly growing administration. A nobility was therefore coming into being. But it still must not be forgotten that the Pili who did nothing outstanding during his lifetime left his children no distinction. The prestige of the Tekuli scarcely lasted beyond one generation unless it were revived by fresh exertions. As the empire grew, and the undertakings of the state became more and more varied, so necessarily the duties of its servants became more specialized. It is very difficult to form an exact opinion of the functions of those officials whose titles have come down to us. It is likely that most of these titles no longer had any relation to their literal meaning, resembling in this the titles used in the Roman or Byzantine Empire, or in France in the days of the kings. The Tlonakaki, pardon me, sorry for that, was probably no more the keeper of the dark house than the constable of France was the person in charge of these stables. But for all that, we can discern 3 classes of the officials in the time of Motekusoma II. In the first place, they were governors of certain cities or strongholds. Although they had the military title of Tlacochtecutli, the Lord of the Spears of Tlacatecat, and even Tlacatecutli, or more rarely Tezcatlipoca, he of the Mirror Serpent, or Tlilancalchi, their duties must, to a large extent, have been civil and administrative. Several towns had two governors at the same time. Otzaman, for example, and Sosolan and Uaxyacac, Oaxaca. So it is likely that one of the governors looked after the administration and the other the command of the garrison. The generic name for the officials occupied with administration and more particularly with the taxes was Calpisque, or house attendants, translated by the conquering Spaniards in the chronicles as major domos. They were chosen from among the Pili, and their principal duty was to organize the cultivation of the lands set aside for the payment of the tax, and to receive the grain, merchandise, and provisions that each province was to furnish at fixed intervals, and to see its transport as far as Mexico. They were obliged to send the emperor reports upon the state of agriculture and commerce. If a famine should break out, it was for them to tell the emperor and under his orders to exempt the province from the payment of tax, or even to open the public stores of corn to distribute it to the people. They were also responsible for the erection of public buildings, for the maintenance of the roads, and for the supply of servants for the imperial palaces. In each province, the Calpisci lived in the chief town, together with his staff, which included a large number of scribes able to keep the tribute registers up to date and to draft reports. And no doubt he had his deputies in the towns and principal villages of his province. Bernal Diaz's account gives some ideas of the powers of these officials and of their formidable authority. The first time the Spaniards met any Calpisque was at Cuyahuitzlan, in the country of the Totonacs, a nation subject to the empire. Some Indians from the same village came running to tell all the caciques who were talking with Cortez that 5 Mexicans had been seen, the tax gatherers of Motecuzoma. On hearing this, they went pale and began to tremble with fear. They left Cortez to himself and went out to welcome them. In all haste, they adorned a room with foliage, prepared some food, and made a great deal of cocoa, which is the best drink that is to be found among them. When these 5 Indians came into the village, they passed by the place where we were with so much confidence and pride that they walked straight on, without speaking either to Cortez or any of the others of us. They wore rich embroidered cloaks, loin cloths of the same nature, and their shining hair was raised in a knot on their heads. Each had a bunch of flowers in his hand, and he smelt to it. And the other Indians, like servants, fanned them with fly whisks. And these arrogant representatives of the central authority had no hesitation in calling the Totonac chiefs before them and violently reprimanding them for having presumed to negotiate with Cortez. Lastly, the third category of appointed officials, the judges, were nominated by a sovereign either from the experienced and elderly dignitaries or from among the common people. At Texcoco, half the higher judges were of noble family and the other half of plebeian origin. All the chroniclers agree in praising the care with which the emperor and his fellow kings chose the judges, taking particular care that they were not drunkards, nor apt to be bribed, nor influenced by personal considerations, nor impassioned in their judgments. Their office had an extraordinary respect and authority. At their disposition there was a kind of police force which, upon their orders, could arrest even the highest officials in any place whatsoever. Their messengers traveled with greatest speed, whether it was day or night, through rain, snow, or hail. Their scribes recorded every case, with the claims of either side, the testimonies and the sentences, and they were very much honored. But woe to the judge who let himself be bought. From reproof it was but a short pace to dismissal, and sometimes to death. A king of Texcoco had a judge executed for favoring a grandee against a working man. All of these people, military or civil officials, soldiers, administrators, judges, serving dignitaries, or the sons of great men waiting for a post, together with the host of messengers, attendants, clerks, and constables who surrounded them, depended upon the secular power. They depended upon the emperor, the head of the state, and they were so many cogs in the huge mechanism of the empire. Beside them, intimately linked by family ties, by education, and by the common debt of religious faith, but depending upon another power, was the clergy. Besides the servants of the state, there were no servants of the gods. There were the servants of the gods. The ruling class was divided into these two parallel hierarchies. The one side conquered, administered, and judged. The other, by its faithful service in the temples, caused the kindness of the gods to rain down upon the earth. Every young Pili was well acquainted with the priestly order from his childhood, since he was brought up in a Kalmikak, a monastery school, where he had shared the life and the austerities of the priests. The son of tradesmen could also go to the Kalmikak, but on something of a supernumerary or marginal footing. It would seem, then, that the priesthood was only open to members of the ruling class, or at a push to the trader's sons. Yet Sahagun insists upon the fact that sometimes the most venerated priests came from very humble families. It must therefore be granted that it was possible for a Masewali to enter the novitiate if he wished. Perhaps if he showed an unusual vocation for the priesthood while he was still at the local school, his masters could transfer him to the Kalmikak. The novice, literally the little priest, was dedicated to Quetzalcoatl, who above all the others was the god of the priests. When he was between 20 and 22 years old, if he decided not to marry and to enter fully into the clerical career, he became a Tlamakaski, a priest, and from then onward he could assume this venerated title, which was in fact the attribute of Quetzalcoatl, god, king, and high priest of the legendary Tula. It was also the title given to Tlaloc, the ancient god of rain and fecundity, to the lesser divinities who attended him, and to the splendid, beneficent young god of music and dancing. To be entitled Tlamakaski was, to some degree, to be already the equal of a god. Most of the priests probably never went further than this stage. As they became old, they would undertake some permanent but subsidiary duties, such as beating upon a drum or helping in the sacrifices, or else they would take charge of a parish and peaceably end their days conducting the services of the local temple. Their rank in the hierarchy was termed Kwakwili. Others, on the other hand, reached a higher level and acquired the title of Tlanamakak. They could be members of the electoral body that chose the emperor, and it was from among them that the highest dignitaries of the Mexican church were taken. Two high priests, equal in power, reigned jointly over this church. The one, Quetzalcoatl Tlamakaski, the plumed serpent, priest of our Lord, was in charge of the worship of Huitzilopochtli. The other, Quetzalcoatl Tlamakaski, the plumed serpent, priest of Tlaloc, of that of Tlaloc. The two gods dominated the great Teocalli together, as we have seen, and in the same manner their two high priests dominated the religious hierarchy. The title of plumed serpent, which they had in common, sealed them with that sanctity which the myth recognized in the Toltec god King Quetzalcoatl, and in short, they were his representatives and successors. Among these priests, says Sahagun, the best were chosen to become the supreme pontiffs, who were called Quetzalcoatl, which means successors of Quetzalcoatl. No heed was paid to birth in his choice, but only to morals and observance of the religion, knowledge of doctrine, and purity of life. Those were chosen who were humble, righteous, and peaceable, earnest and reasonable, not given to levity, but sober, severe, and scrupulous in morals, full of love and charity, compassion and friendship for all, God-fearing and devout. This, it must be admitted, is uncommonly warm praise, coming from the pen of a Catholic monk. These two high priests were, according to the same authority, equal in status and in honor, and they were surrounded by the deepest respect. The emperor himself went in person to visit them. Their double presence at the head of the religious world consecrated the union of the two basic ideologies of Mexico, which the Aztecs had brought together when they became the ruling nation. On the one side there was Huitzilopochtli, the solar god of war and the near relation of the hunting gods, the pattern of the soldier and the prototype of the sacrificed victim who was to be reborn for a carefree immortality as a bird. And on the other, Tlaloc, the old rain god and god of the farmer's plenty, who without fighting makes the maize spring up and all the plants that men eat, the benign wizard who keeps famine and drought away. On the one hand, the religion of the warlike nomad, and on the other, that of the settled peasants, each with its own vision and its own paradise. Under the two high priests, there were many prelates, who were responsible either for some given branch of religious activity or for the worship of some particular god. The most important of them, the Secretary General of the Church, as it were, had the title of Mexica Tehuatzin, the venerable Mexican in charge of the gods. He was chosen by the two Quetzalcoatl, and he controlled other less important priests, somewhat like bishops, and he saw to it that everything to do with divine worship in all places and provinces was carried out diligently and perfectly, according to the laws and customs of the former pontiffs. He controlled all matters concerning the worship of the gods in the provinces subjected to Mexico. His competence also included the discipline of the priestly body, and his supervision of the education given in the Calmecac. His assistants were the Huitznahuac Tehuatzin, who was principally concerned with ritual on the one hand, and on the other the Tepan Tehuatzin, who attended to questions that concern education. A treasurer, the Tlaquimilotecutli, had care of the holy vessels and other religious objects, and of the temple's estates. The wealth of the gods was enormous. They were not only the buildings of their land, the statues, the countless implements of worship, which were of great value, and the offerings of provisions and clothes continually brought by the faithful, but also the agricultural land which the ecclesiastical corporations let out or had worked for them, and their share of the tribute from the subjected provinces. The piety of the emperors rained gifts upon the temples. At Texcoco, 15 important villages and their dependencies were set aside solely for their maintenance and repair and for supplying them with wood for their never-extinguished fires. At Mexico, there was the same arrangement. Some villages furnished the temples with maize, wood, meat, and incense, and paid no other kind of tax. The temples, therefore, had special granaries beside them, and these contained important reserves not only of the provisions for the priests, but also those which they gave to the poor and sick. They had hospitals at Mexico, Texcoco, Cholula, and other places. The management of all these properties must have called for a very considerable staff of scribes in the treasurer's department. There appear to have been an exceedingly large number of priests assigned to the various gods. No deity would have been satisfied with less than his own household, a chief, priest, ministrants, and novices. The 400 gods of drink and drunkenness were served by an equal number of priests under the guidance of the Ometotzin, the venerable two-rabbit, whose name was that as one of these gods, Ometotzin. This was a very general practice. Each priest bore the name of the god he served and whom, serving, he incarnated. The rites had proliferated to an enormous extent, and a host of priests busied themselves over the accomplishment of this or that particular task. For the division of labor had reached a very high pitch. For example, the Ixcosauqui Tzonmolco Teowa was responsible only for the supplying of wood to the temple of the fire god, and the Pochlan Teowa Yacatecutli for the organization of the feast of the god of the merchants. Clearly it was essential that the calendar of feasts should be kept up to date, and the sequence of ceremonies exactly followed. This very important duty was entrusted to the Epcoaqualtzin, the venerable minister of the Temple of the Rain, who in spite of his limiting title had authority under the Huitzilopochtli Teotihuacan over the entirety of the religious scene, at least in its material aspect. Women were by no means excluded from the priesthood. Some 20 or 40 days after birth, a girl might be brought to the temple by her mother. The woman would give the priest a censer and some copal incense, and this would establish a reciprocal agreement. But it was only when she was a grown girl, Ishposhli, that the novice would go into religion, with the title of priestess, or literally women priest, Siwatla Makaski. As long as she kept this title, she was bound to celibacy, but it was quite possible for her to marry if she were asked in marriage, if the words were properly said, if the fathers, the mothers, and the notables agreed. An unusually solemn marriage service took place, and then she left the temple for her house. But it appears that many prefer to give themselves up entirely to religion. One finds a great many priestesses ministering on various occasions in the traditional accounts. The feast of the great goddess Tosi, our grandmother, was directed by a woman, a Siua Kwakwili. Another priestess, called the Itztaciatl, the white woman, was in charge of the physical preparation of certain ceremonies, particularly the sweeping of the holy places and the lighting of the fires. During Gacholi, the 14th month, a great many women went to the temple of Mishkwat, the hunter and warrior, to take their children to the old priestesses there. They took the children and danced with them in their arms. Then the mothers, having made the priestesses a present of sweetmeats or delicacies, took their children away again. This ceremony lasted all the morning. During the month of Ochpanitzli, it was the young priestesses of the goddess of maize who played the most important part in the religious celebrations. Each of them represented the goddess, and each of them carried 7 ears of maize wrapped in rich cloth on her back. Their faces were painted, their arms and legs adorned with feathers. Singing, they went into procession with the priests of the same goddess, and at sunset they threw handfuls of colored maize and calabash seeds to the crowd, who struggled and scrambled for them, because they were a token of wealth and plenty for the coming year. Torquemada states that some of these young priestesses took vows for 1 year or more to win some favor from heaven, such as the healing of an invalid or a happy marriage, but it seems that they never took vows forever. They were guarded, supervised, and taught by old women, and they looked after the temple, offering incense before the images of the gods at nightfall, at midnight, and at dawn. They also wove cloaks for the priests and the idols. From priesthood to divination, to medicine, and at last to magic, so good shades into evil, respect into fear, and hatred. On its shadowy frontiers, the world of religion merged with that of the malignant warlock and the sorcerer. Divination, in a true sense of the word, was not only permitted but practiced by a particular class of priests called the Tonalpuke. They were educated in the monastery schools, for it was there that a knowledge of the characters used in the divinatory calendar was taught, and indeed this knowledge formed an integral part of the higher education. In this context, it is worth remembering the importance of augury in the palmy days of Rome. But it seemed that these soothsayers did not become members of a temple when they were qualified. They set up on their own account. Neither business nor income can have lacked, for every family necessarily went to a soothsayer whenever a child was born. Furthermore, there was no important occasion in life, marriage, leaving for a journey, or a military expedition, etc., whose date was not fixed by these soothsayers, either at the request of private persons or of officials. Each of these consultations was paid for by a meal, by presents, several cloaks, some turkeys, and a load of victuals. The doctors, men and women, were officially recognized, although their spirit was not always far from that of the black magicians, and they openly took part in many ceremonies. The midwives should also be mentioned. These women helped at the birth of the child, but more than that, they harangued it with the necessary moral and religious speeches, and, the soothsayers having been duly consulted, endowed it with its baptismal name. They had a highly respected position in society, and no doubt they were quite well-to-do. Finally, at the opposite end of the pole of the religious world from the priests, there were the magicians, the sorcerers, the formidable experts in spells, who were believed to have such wide and multifarious powers. They could change themselves into animals. They knew magic words that bewitch women and turn affections wherever they choose, and their spells could kill from a great way off. There were men magicians and women magicians, and they kept their dark practices hidden. But for all that, they were known well enough for people to come by night to buy their aid. It was said that their power came from their having been born under a malignant sign, one rain or one wind, and that for their purposes they always waited for a day that came under a sign favorable to them. The figure 9, which was the figure of the night gods and of hell and of death, was particularly auspicious for them. One of the most frequently mentioned crimes of sorcery constituted of theft. 15 or 20 magicians would combine to rob a family. They would come to the door by night, and by means of certain charms they would strike the people of the house motionless. It was as if they were all dead, and yet they heard and saw everything that happened. The thieves lit torches and looked through the house to find what there was to eat. They all ate quite calmly, and none of the people could hinder them, for they were all, as who should say, turned to stone and out of their senses. Then when the sorcerers had eaten and thoroughly satisfied themselves, they went into the storeroom and granaries and took everything they found there: clothes, gold, silver, precious stones, and feathers. And it is even said that they did many great foul things to the women of the house. The sorcerers, then, were severely condemned by public opinion and severely punished by the law. If they were caught, they were either hanged or sacrificed before an altar, their hearts being torn out. In the reign of Chimalpopoca, a man of Cuautitlan and his wife were sentenced to death because they had stupefied a peasant from Tenayuca by charms, and had stolen his maize during his sleep. Apart from the minority of dangerous outcasts, all the classes that have just been mentioned, warriors, officials, and priests, had the common character of directors in society and state. Together they made up a ruling order. It was an order of recent origin, vigorous, and continually strengthened by the new blood brought in by the plebeians, who could accede to the highest offices, whether they were military, administrative, or religious. Birth played its part, but it was still personal merit that raised a man, and lack of it that lowered him. The Mexican always bore in mind that honors were no more stable than running water, and that a man born noble might die a slave. It appears that an aristocratic reaction took place at the beginning of the 16th century, under the reign of Moctezuma II, and that the reactionaries tried to expel the sons of plebeians from the higher places. According to the documents, however, this affected only the embassies that went abroad, for it was not decent that the Masehuales should go into the king's palaces. It is possible that this reaction might have gone on to the point of bringing a purely hereditary nobility into existence, but there was a strong influence that worked in the other direction every day: the continual pressure of war and conquest, which brought brave and ambitious men up to the top. When one reflects upon this ruling class's way of life, one is much struck by the fact that one of its essential sections, the priests, lived in austere poverty, and that the others, the soldiers and the civil servants, only came by wealth in the form of estates, houses, slaves, clothes, victuals, jewels, etc., as a consequence of their rank or office. Wealth was not pursued for itself. It came as a function of increasing power and official expenses. It was an income and not a capital. The only thing that really counted in the Tecutli's eyes was reputation. Another class existed, however, in which these values were reversed, a class preoccupied with wealth, not only indifferent to prestige but averse to it. It was a class below the level of the ruling class, but it was in the act of rising towards it. A class so different, with its own customs, its laws, and organization, that it almost belonged to another world. A rising class, the traders. A very great many Mexicans engaged in trade, some from time to time, and some continuously. There were the peasants who sold their maize, vegetables, and poultry in the market, the women who sold all sorts of cooked meals in the streets, the merchants who sold cloth, shoes, drinks, skins, pots, rope, pipes, and various useful objects, and the fishermen who daily brought in their fish from the lake, and frogs and shellfish. The small and medium traders did not form a distinct class of the population. The name of Posteca traders was kept for the members of the powerful corporations who were in charge of foreign trade and which had the monopoly of it. They organized and guided the caravans of porters, which went from the Central Valley to the remote, almost legendary provinces on the Pacific coast or on the Gulf. They were sold the produce of Mexico: cloth, rabbit's hair blankets, embroidered clothes, golden jewels, obsidian and copper earrings, obsidian knives, cochineal dye, medicinal herbs, and herbs for making scent, and they brought back such luxurious things as the translucid green jade, chalchihuitl, emeralds, quetzalitzli, seashells, tortoiseshell to make these stirring spoons for cocoa, jaguar and puma skins, amber, parrot, quetzal, and xiutotot plumes. Their trade, therefore, consisted in the export of manufactured goods and the import of luxurious foreign commodities. It may be observed in passing that these exchanges are not in themselves enough to explain the economic relations between the cold lands of the center and the hot lands of the southeast. Jewels of gold were exported, but gold was not imported. Cotton cloth was sent out, but cotton yarn was not brought in. It was the tribute or the taxes that the provinces were obliged to pay that provided Mexico with its raw materials. For example, the Mixtec province of Yoautepec had annually to send in 40 gold discs, each a finger thick and about 2 inches across. The province of Tlaxcuauco, 20 calabashes of gold dust, and those of Huatoshco and Ahuilizapan, 1,600 bales of cotton. These raw materials were worked up in Mexico, and having become cloth or jewels, they continued their journey towards the south on the shoulders of the porters led by the Posteca. There were merchant guilds in some 10 towns or large villages of the central plateau: Texcoco, Azcapotzalco, Huitzilopochtli, Huexotla, Cuautitlan, Coatlinjan, Chalco, Otumba, and of course at Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco. It was in Tlatelolco before the Mexicans annexed it, and while it was still independent that the Postecas seem to have had the greatest influence. They lived in 7 districts, and one of these was called Oxlan, which gave them their name. Each of the districts had a commercial court or seat, literally a mat, petlat. If Chimalpahin is to be believed, it was only in the year 12 Tecpat, 1504, that Impeuch Pochtecayot Mexico, that began trading in Mexico. He means, no doubt, that at this late date the guild was officially organized, after the manner of the Posteca of Tlatelolco, and at their instigation, they having been Mexican citizens for 31 years. The Tlatelolca merchants, for their part, had begun in the earliest days of the 15th century, when the Tlatoani Tlacateot, who came to the throne in 1407, reigned over their city. And we are told that it was they who first brought the fine cotton cloth to the then still countrified people of the Lake City. Under the second ruler of Tlatelolco, Cuauhtlatoa, 1428 through 1467, they imported lip ornaments, feathers, and the skins of wild animals. Under Moquihuixli, their last independent sovereign, the list of the goods that they brought back from their distant long voyages was much longer, and cocoa figures prominently in it, having by then become the usual drink of the better sort of people. The guild had at its head 2 chiefs, the Pochtecatlatloque, merchant lords, whose name carried the honorific suffix "tzin." After the annexation of Tlatelolco, the traders of that city and those of Tenochtitlan were closely associated, although the 2 bodies retained their individuality. Their chiefs, which numbered 3 or 5, were old men, and for this reason they no longer went out on the tiring and perilous voyages, but entrusted their goods to the younger Posteca to be sold on their account. They supervised the departure of the caravans and presided over these ceremonies at their going and their coming back. They represented the guilds before the emperor, and they judged all lawsuits within the trading class, not merely cases to do with commerce, but cases of every kind. Their courts could pronounce all sentences, including that of death. This privilege was all the more striking because in matters of justice, there was no other exceptions whatever in Mexican society, and the emperor's courts judged everybody, from the Tecutling to the Masawali. The Postecat alone stood outside this rule. In many respects, the traders formed a nation within a nation. Unlike the soldiers and even the priests, they did not draw recruits from the common people. They were traders from father to son. They all lived together in the same districts, and they married among themselves. They had their own gods, their own feasts, and they worshipped in their own manner, for during their long journeys they had no priests but themselves. We have seen the very marked graduation that existed in the ruling class. The same applied to the merchants, and there were many ranks interposed between the chiefs and the young traders heading out on his first voyage. There were the Teconeneke, traveling lords, respected for their long and dangerous expeditions. The Nawalotsomeka, disguised traders, who wore clothes and spoke the language of the hostile tribes in order to reach the mysterious Zinacantlan to buy amber and quetzal plumes. The Tealtianime, who had offered slaves in sacrifice. The Teyawa Loanime, those who surround the enemy, and the Tequanime, the wild beasts. The last two sound strange, applied to traders. But the truth is that their commerce was a continual adventure. The farther they were from Mexico, the more dangerous their life became. They were thought to be spies as well as merchants, as indeed they were, and they had to contend with the hostility of the tribes who were as yet unconquered. Their goods aroused the cupidity of the Highlanders. Brigands attacked their caravans, and the Postecat had to transform himself into a warrior in order to survive. This in fact was the original cause for the rise of the merchant class in a social system of the ancient city. In the reign of Ahuitzotl, a column of Mexican traders was surrounded in the village of the Anahuac Ayotlan on the Pacific side of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. They were besieged by contingents from different tribes, but fighting continuously, they held out for 4 years, and when the future emperor Moctezuma, who was then Tlacochcalcat, came at the head of a Mexican army to extricate them, he met the victorious Posteca on the road, laden with the spoils of their attackers. With their hair down to their waists and their air of exhaustion and of triumph, these merchant warriors made an extraordinary impression in Mexico, where they were received by the emperor with great magnificence. When they were welcomed at the palace, they laid at Ahuitzot's feet the standards and the insignia made of precious feathers that they had captured in battle. He called them my uncles, and at once gave them the right to wear jewels of gold and feather ornaments, a right that was limited to their particular holidays, however, whereas the ruling class had their privilege without any restrictions. According to Sahagun, the spokesman who answered Ahuitzotl in the name of the merchant said, "We, your uncles, the Posteca who are here, we have risked our heads and our lives, and we have labored day and night. For although we are called traitors, and although we seem to be traitors, we are captains and soldiers who, in a disguised fashion, go out to conquer." This is a remarkable speech, for it must be seen as the expression of a kind of legal fiction designed to allow the merchants certain social advantages and to justify to the soldiers what would formerly have appeared intolerable effrontery. In fact, it was untrue to say that the Posteca were camouflaged soldiers. They were primarily and above all merchants, but the very conditions of their trading sometimes brought them into military action, and in this respect, the siege that they were able to withstand in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec was of decisive importance in their history. This side of their life was really quite secondary, in spite of everything, but nevertheless it was this side that was most emphasized from that time onwards. Ahuitzotl, and after him Moctezuma II, saw how useful these tireless traders could be to the empire. For it may be said that in these 2 reigns conquest followed the caravan, and the flag took the place of the merchant's cloth. As a recompense, the trader was officially supposed to have taken up his calling only to disassemble his true character, which was that of a warrior, a pious falsehood that nevertheless allowed the mercantile class to rise in a society of whose fundamental principle it remained fundamentally ignorant. And indeed, what a total opposition there was between the way of life of the Postecat and that of the ruling class. the one who was wholly taken up with service and reputation, the other with the pursuit of personal gain. The high official wore the embroidered cloak and the plume of his rank with pride. The trader went meekly along in a patched and homely garment. If one met him with his porters and their costly burdens, he would softly deny that he could be the owner. He was only an intermediary. On his return from a voyage, he would bring his goods to the warehouse by night, secretly over the water of the lake, and store them under the name of a relation or a friend. Suppose that a Portecat should find himself growing rich and decide to give a banquet. He would invite his equals and his betters in the commercial world, but he would have to put up with a great deal of offensiveness on their part. They would pull his goods about, flatly accusing him of having stolen them, and all this would have to be accepted with humble tears. It was only after he had undergone this treatment that he was allowed, or indeed obliged, to show his generosity in the feast that he offered, a feast of such proportions that the guests, and even the inhabitants of the whole quarter, could eat and drink for 2 days and then carry the leavings home. But apart from these exceptional occasions, the traders did not parade their wealth, but on the contrary, they were lowly and humble. They did not wish to be thought rich, nor have the reputation of wealth. They desired neither honors nor fame, and they walked humbly, without raising their eyes. They went in worn-out cloaks, and they feared honor and renown above all. This humility that they put on, this desire to remain unnoticed, was the currency in which they paid for their social rise, the coin with which they bought pardon for their real and ever-growing importance. For the ruling class would bear their rivalry only if they avoided all open conflict. If the Posteca grew haughty in their richness, the emperor saw some transparent excuse to bring them down and put them to death. Not that they were guilty, but out of hatred for their arrogance and pride. And he shared out their goods and presents to the old warriors. In other words, death and deprivation hovered over the head of the trader, who forgot his role and made the mistake of showing off his wealth. Nevertheless, their rise was sure. Their children could already go to the Kalmakak with the children of the dignitaries. During the month that was sacred to Huitzilopochtli, the merchants were allowed to sacrifice slaves that they had brought to the great national deity, after the warriors had sacrificed the prisoners that they had taken in battle. Thus, the Postecat imitated the Takutli, although it was on a somewhat lower level. If a trader died when he was on his voyage, his body was burnt, and he was presumed to have joined the sun in heaven, as if he had been a warrior killed on the battlefield. The god of the Posteca was worshipped together with the other great deities, and he had a special hymn. And finally, if it is true that the traders had to pay a tax levied on their goods, they were nevertheless exempt from manual labor and personal service. In a society basically concerned with war and religion, therefore, a recently formed mercantile class was steadily climbing towards the top. It still had a very long way to go, and was obliged to be very careful to avoid a violent, hostile reaction. But this class supplied the increasing luxury of the others, and it had become indispensable. Its wealth became an instrument of greater and greater power as the ruling class progressively abandoned the frugality of the earlier generations, never to return. Although it is necessarily guesswork, one can speculate upon what would have happened if the foreign invasion had not cut short all the development by destroying the whole of Mexican society and the state itself. Perhaps these merchant lords, who already had such important privileges, their own courts and the badges of honor that Huitzol had granted them, would have become chiefs of a bourgeoisie that would have either have become part of the ruling class, or would have displaced it and taken its power. But perhaps, on the other hand, the aristocracy would have reinforced its position by crushing any further attempt at rising. All that can be said is that there was nothing rigid about the structure of the Mexican community in 1519. It was in a state of flux, and perhaps the most mobile element in it was the class of Posteca. The class represented the principle of personal capital as opposed to that of income attached to office, of wealth as opposed to renown, of luxury as opposed to austerity. It was repressed, and it took deceit and hypocrisy, but already the grandees condescended to go to the merchants' feasts and accept their presents, much as the French nobles of the ancient regime mixed with the wealthy tax farmers. Even very important dignitaries married their daughters, at least as secondary wives. This was the case with Nezahualpilli, king of Texcoco, whose favorite was the woman they called the Lady of Tula. Not that she was of noble lineage, for she was only a merchant's daughter. The Craftsmen. The farther down the social level, the more scanty the information. Neither the native historians nor the Spanish chroniclers have troubled to describe the life of the lower orders. The craftsmen form a numerous class with its own quarters and organizations, below that of the Posteca, but in some respects allied to it. Not very much is known about the useful but unexciting guilds such as those of the quarrymen or salters, which are sometimes mentioned, but in passing and without detail. The only groups that were much noticed were those outstanding ones devoted to the so-called minor arts of the goldsmith, the jeweler, and the maker of feather mosaics. These craftsmen were known by the name of Tolteca, the Toltecs, for the origin of their crafts was assigned by tradition to the ancient Toltec civilization, the civilization of the god king Quetzalcoatl, and the marvelous city of Tula. Quetzalcoatl discovered great treasures of emeralds, of fine turquoises, gold, silver, coral shells, and the plumes of Quetzal, Tlaquetzal, Zacuan, Zinitzcan, and Ayocan in his place. He had mats of feathers and precious gems and silver, wrote the Aztec editor of the Annals of Cuautitlan. And Sahagún goes farther. They were called Toltecs, which means exquisitely skilled workmen. They were all craftsmen of the first order, painters, lapidaries, feather workers. They found mines of those gems, which in Mexico they call chihuit, that is to say turquoise. Also gold and silver mines, and amber, crystal, and the stones called amethysts, pearls, and all kinds of stones that they made into jewels. They knew a great deal. Nothing was difficult for them. They cut the greenstone, cauchihuit. They melted the gold, teoquitla pizzaya. As we have seen, the generic term for their techniques was the Toltecayot, the matter of the Toltecs, or the Toltec thing, and from these artisans drew their honorable name. Besides, their claim to an illustrious origin was by no means entirely without foundation. The nomadic Aztec tribe that, in 1325, had only just settled in the marshes, certainly had no such craftsmen among its members, and those who subsequently became members of the tribe can only have been drawn from the survivors of earlier times. Ixtlisochitl states that the people of the little towns of the lake, such as Culhuacan or Xochimilco, preserved the ancient arts of Tula after that city's fall, as well as its language and customs. The lapidaries, for example, were held to descend directly from the men of Xochimilco. A strange air of foreignness hung about these craftsmen. For the other Mexicans, who were members of a particularly homogeneous tribe, they were men of a remote, different, and even mysterious origin. It was said that the feather workers, who made the exquisite feather mosaics for the great men, their head ornaments, plumes, and insignia, were the original people of the country. They and their god Coyotlinawal, he who is disguised as a wolf, had founded Amatlan, their village, about the temple where his image stood, beautiful with gold and plumes, and dressed in the skin of a wolf. In the historical period, this village of Amatlan was never anything but a district in the capital, but there are traces that seem to show that it was absorbed by Mexico as a result of a war. The hymn in honor of the great Mexican god Huitzilopochtli Iquic has these lines: "Our enemies are the men of Amatlan, Amanteca, Toyahuan. Gather them together for me. They shall be in their houses, the enemies." And the Aztec commentator states explicitly, "Their houses shall be burnt down." That is, they shall be conquered. This old sacred poem, therefore, retains a vestige of the period at which the Amanteca were not part of the city, but were still enemies upon whose heads the wrath of Huitzilopochtli was to be called down. The goldsmiths, too, the Teoquitlahuaque, had their aura of mystery, and although they were also called Toltecs, their customs, strangely enough, seemed to link them with another nation, far more remote and exotic in the eyes of the Aztecs. Their great god was Xipetotec, who was the god of the people of the coast, properly speaking, the god of Zapotlan, who carried a golden shield in his hand like those of the men of the coast. He was worshipped in a temple called Yopico, the Yopi ground, and Yopi was the name of a people whose country lay on the west side of the mountains, stretching from them to the Pacific between the Mexicans and the Mixtecs, a people who were able to remain largely independent of the Aztec Empire. These Yopi, who were also called Tlapaneca, painted men, because they dyed their bodies, were classed as barbarians. That is, they did not speak the Mexican language. They lived in a poor and sterile country, famine-struck, harsh and rugged, but they knew the precious stones and their virtues, says Sahagún. Consequently, they were considered rich, in spite of the poverty of their soil. The working of gold was brought to central Mexico at a late period, and some of the finest examples of the art had been found in the Mixtec country. So, bearing this in mind, one is led to suppose that the goldsmiths, with their god from the coast in his golden cloak, brought with them a southern influence that was essentially foreign to the original Aztec culture. At the date of which we are speaking, they were quite certainly embedded in the Mexican community, but still as a distinct body with their own customs. The featherworkers of Amantlan associated with almost nobody except the traders of Pochlan, their neighbors. With them, however, they feasted at a common table. The featherworkers, like the Posteca, were allowed to sacrifice a slave after the prisoners of war in the month Panquetzalitzli. The whole guild clubbed together to buy the victim. In the month Tlaxochimaco, they held their own feast in honor of their local god and of the 4 other gods and 2 goddesses of their guild, and they vowed to devote their children to the same trade that they followed. These workmen, with their simple tools, their exquisite taste, and their infinite patience, could produce masterpieces. Albrecht Dürer saw some of the presents given by Moctezuma to Cortez and by him sent to Charles V, and he wrote, "These objects are so valuable that they have been set at 100,000 florins. In all my life I have never seen anything that rejoiced my heart so much. I have found an admirable art in them, and I have been astonished by the subtle spirit of the men of these strange countries." Some of these craftsmen worked directly for the emperor in the palace, as Bernal Diaz describes them. Others worked at home, receiving the stones, feather, or metal from the great men or the traders and working them up into jewels or ornaments. Each workshop consisted only of one family. The featherworkers' wives, for example, spun and embroidered, made rabbit's hair blankets, or devoted themselves to the dyeing of the feathers. The children stayed with their parents to learn their trade. The social standing of the Tolteca was modest. They made no claims to power or wealth, but it was not without a certain esteem. Young dignitaries did not think it beneath them, for their exercise and recreation, to learn some arts or accomplishments such as painting, engraving on stone, wood or gold, or the working of gems. It seemed that the artist was very well paid. It is true that the case is exceptional, but on one occasion each of the 14 sculptors who made the statue of Moctezuma II received clothes for himself and his wife, 10 loads of calabashes, 10 loads of beans, 2 loads of each of peppers, cocoa and cotton, and a boatload of maize, before he began. And when the work was finished, 2 slaves, 2 loads of cocoa, some crockery and salt, and a load of cloth. It is likely that at the various stages the craftsmen received very considerable remuneration, but on the other hand they were subject to tax, although, like the traders, they were not obliged to provide personal service or agricultural labor. Furthermore, their guilds enjoyed what may be termed the right of corporate personality, and their chiefs represented them before the central authority and the law. Here again, then, we are dealing with a class whose privileges raise them above the plebeian mass. But the distinction between them and the traders is that, in this case, we find no trace of that more or less repressed tendency to rise in the social scale, nor of any of the tension that existed between the ruling class and the traders, nor the habits of concealment of the Posteca. The craftsman had nothing to hide. He did not have to ask to pardon for his importance, for he neither had nor claimed it. He had his own place in this complex society, and he seems to have meant to stay there, for whereas the trading class was dynamic, that of the artisans was static, happy to remain in the position where its immunities and the general respect for its abilities had placed it one step higher than those with no privileges, just above the common people. The common people. The Aztec word Masewaltin in the plural, stood in the 16th century for any person who did not belong to any of the social categories that have just been mentioned and yet who was not a slave. The common people, or the plebeians as the Spanish often translated it. It appears that in the beginning this word simply meant worker. It comes from the word masewalo, to work, to acquire merit, from which is derived masewalitzli, which does not mean work, but an act meant to acquire merit. It is the word used to describe those dances which were performed before the images of the gods in order to acquire merit in their eyes. It is obvious that it had no pejorative sense. Literature is full of examples in which the meaning of Massawatin is just the people, without any implication of inferiority. Yet it is certain that in time the word did take on a slightly contemptuous ring. The Masawali was thought to be common. The Masawalatoa meant to speak boorishly, and the Masawatik meant vulgar. In a great city, although there might be some thousands of officials, merchants, and craftsmen, there were a very great many more Masawati, the vast majority of the population. They were full citizens, members of the tribe and the district, but they were liable to certain inescapable duties. Their position can best be shown by a list of their rights and corresponding obligations. As a Mexican and a member of a Capuli of Tenochtitlan or Tlatelolco, the Masawali had a right to a life interest in the plot upon which he built his house and in the piece of land that he cultivated. His children could go to the local school. He and his family took their ritual and traditional part in the ceremonies of the district and the city, and when the authorities handed out food and clothes, he had his share. If he were courageous and intelligent, he could rise out of his class and become honored and wealthy. He had a vote in the election of the local chiefs, although in the last resort their appointment depended upon the emperor. But insofar as he remained a plebeian, and if he did nothing to distinguish himself in the first years of his life in the world, he was subject to grave obligations. To begin with, there was military service, although no Mexican thought of this as a burden, but rather as something that was both an honor and a religious right. And then when the Masawali was inscribed on the rolls of the urban officials, and at any time he could be called upon for communal work, cleaning, maintenance, the building of roads, bridges, and temples. If the palace needed water or wood for its fires, a fatigue party of Masawatin was ordered at once. Furthermore, our Masawali was required to pay taxes, which were assessed within each district by the chief and the elders of the council, together with officials who supervised the payment. Yet it must be admitted that compared with the Masawatin of the subject towns, or even more of the countryside, the Masawali who belonged to any of the three confederate cities at the head of the empire, Mexico, Texcoco, and Tlatelolco, was in a privileged category. He paid taxes, but on the other hand he must have been largely compensated for this by a share in the distribution, very like the Roman dole, of clothes and provisions that were provided by the tribute of his provinces. His tribe was the ruling nation, and in his degree he benefited from the system. It was the provincial who paid. It was the peasant, with his unpolished speech and manners, who was the real problem, who was the real plebeian. It was always his labor that was requisitioned, always his harvest that was laid under contribution. He bore the whole weight of the social edifice. Nevertheless, this population of free men, in the town and the country, had a status which was not without a certain dignity, however humble it may have been. A status, moreover, which prevented no man from rising above the common level if his personal courage or good fortune enabled him to do so. No one could take the land he worked away from a Masawali, nor expel him from his Capuli, except as a punishment for serious crimes or offenses. Apart from natural disasters for war, he did not run the risk of starving, nor of dying from his accustomed surroundings, his neighbors, and his gods. As for the chances and success and improvement, it has already been shown that they were quite considerable. The army and the less accessible priesthood could lead to the highest offices, and the protection of a great man opened the way to a great number of employments, less brilliant, it is true, but still respectable and no doubt lucrative. Ushers, guards, messengers, minor officials of all kinds, or the emperor's favor or the kindness of a noblewoman might completely change a plebeian's life. This happened to be a man named Xochitlacotzin, a gardener in the suburbs of Mexico, in the reign of Moctezuma II. Although he was a plebeian, he would not give way to the emperor, who was delighted by his integrity and made him a lord, observing that he looked upon him as a kinsman. Jimapahin tells how a daughter of Itzcoatl fell in love with a Masewa Tzintli, a little plebeian of Atotonilco. She married him, and because of this royal marriage he became lord of his village. This is to say that no impenetrable walls separated the classes, and that the homeless life was not without its hope. Beneath the plebeian freemen and above the lowest class of all, the slaves, there was still another category, that of the landless peasants. Their name, Tlamite, literally hand of the earth, whence rural manual labor is translated from farm laborer or day laborer. It is hard to see how this class can have come into being, since every member of the tribe had a right to a piece of arable land. Perhaps these landless peasants were now what we call displaced persons, victims of the wars and coup d'etat which had been so frequent in the cities of central Mexico in the preceding 200 or 300 years. Having fled from their tribe, they may have offered themselves to some Mexican dignitary who provided them with land, or perhaps they were families who stayed when the farmland of conquered cities was given to Aztec lords. However, that may have been the Tlamite lived on the land that was allowed with him and his family, and if the tenure of the estate passed on to inheritors, he remained, being bound to the soil. In return for this land that he worked for himself, he provided water and wood, domestic service, and paid a rent, either by giving a part of his harvest or by working a separate field for the great man whose dependent he was. What we have here, therefore, is sharecropping or tenant farming. Unlike the Masawali, the Tlamite was not a citizen. He did not have the citizen's rights, but he did not have the citizen's expenses either. He paid no taxes, and he could not be called on for labor. That is, he owed nothing to the city and nothing to the Kapuli. In short, he looked only to the man who had granted him his land. There were 2 points, however, in which his status resembled that of the plebeian. He was liable for military service, a most important exception, and he was under the civil and criminal jurisdiction of the Aztec ruler. He was not, therefore, entirely given up to the authority of a private person. He was still a free man. The slaves. Below everyone, lower than anybody else at the bottom of the society, we have what, for want of a better word, must be called the slave. Tlacotli. Tlatlacotin in the plural. He was not a citizen. He was not a subject. He belonged like a chattel to his master. In this particular, his condition resembled slavery as it was understood in Western antiquity or, until not long ago, the modern world. But in many others, Mexican servitude was quite unlike the accepted notion of slavery. The manner in which slaves are made by those natives of New Spain is very different from the practices of the European nations, writes Father Motolinia. It even seems to me that those who are called slaves in Mexico do not fulfill many of the conditions of a slave properly so called. When the Spaniards introduced the kind of slavery current in Europe into Mexico, after the conquest of the wretched Indians, who were branded on the face with red-hot irons, put down in the mines, and used worse than animals, must have envied the lot of the former slaves. They had certainly not gained by the change. What were the distinguishing characteristics of the slave status in Mexico at the beginning of the 16th century? The first was that the slave worked for another man as a farm laborer or as a servant or perhaps as a porter in the merchants' caravans. The women slaves spun, wove, sewed, or mended clothes in their master's house, and they were often among his concubines. The Tlacotli had no pay for his work, but he was housed, fed, and clothed like an ordinary citizen. They treat their slaves almost like their children. And there are examples quoted of slaves promoted major domo and given the charge of great estates and command over freemen. Better still, and here we leave the classical idea of slavery altogether, the Tlatlacotin could possess goods, save money, buy land and houses, and even slaves for their own service. There was nothing to forbid marriage between slaves and citizens. A slave could marry a free woman, and not infrequently a widow would marry one of her slaves, who would thus become head of the family. All children were born free, including those both of whose parents were slaves. No inherited shame was attached to this state. The Emperor Itzcoatl, one of the greatest in Mexican history, was the son of a slave woman by Acamapishli. Furthermore, the state of slavery was not necessarily perpetual. Many were freed at their master's death by his will. Others were emancipated by the emperor or one of his fellow kings. Motekusama II and Nesahuapili, for example, decreed very considerable manumissions. Any slave who was about to be sold could try to regain his liberty. If he escaped from the market, nobody except his master and his master's son might stop him without being enslaved himself. And if once he succeeded in getting into the palace, the royal presence instantly released him from all bonds, and he was a free man. Others again could buy themselves out of slavery, either paying their master back the price he had given for them, which justifies the statement that slaves could become free and prosperous, or in having themselves replaced by another member of their family. Several brothers could, in turn, undertake the service of the same master. So slavery here had nothing of the hopeless character that it had in other times and in other places. It was a state that might be only temporary. But how did a man become a slave? In replying to this question, one realizes that there were many kinds of slave and that the status of the different kinds differed widely. Prisoners of war, or at least those who were not sacrificed as soon as the campaign was over, were sold as slaves either at Tlatelolco or Azcapotzalco. It is said that the richest traders were those who raided the unsubjected tribes for slaves. Some cities were obliged to supply a given number of slaves as a tax, and they certainly obtained them outside the empire by armed expeditions. Cihuatlan on the Pacific sent Tarascan and Cuitlatec prisoners to Mexico. Zompanco sent Tlapanecs and Teotitlan Mixtecs. All these slaves, foreigners classed as barbarians and prisoners of war, primarily intended for death before the altar, might be considered as so many victims under suspended sentence, and most of them ended their lives stoically upon the bloody stone at the top of a pyramid. Slavery could also originate as a punishment for certain crimes and felonies. Mexican justice knew nothing of the long sentences of imprisonment so familiar to our courts. But the man who stole from a temple or in the palace, or who burglared a private house, became the slave of the temple, the lord, or the private person, unless he ransomed himself by paying back the amount of his theft, if necessary with his family's help. Slavery, too, was the punishment of those who kidnapped children to sell them as slaves, of those who prevented a slave from escaping to the palace to free himself, those who sold goods that did not belong to them, those who plotted against the emperor. And in the more remarkable case of a man who took another slave as his mistress, if she died in childbed, he was enslaved to replace the woman whose death he had brought about. But contemporary documents seem to show that the most numerous class was that of the voluntary slaves. A free man or woman had the disposition of his person, and by a solemn deed he could sell himself to another. Those who decided upon this course were sometimes drunken and idle creatures, tired of working their land, which in any case was taken from them by the Kapuli when it had been left uncultivated for 3 years, or sometimes players of the ball game, or patoli, ruined by their addiction to it, or sometimes women who, having played the whore for nothing most of the time, ended by selling themselves to be sure of food and a roof, and to be able to dress well. The act of giving up one's liberty was accompanied by a ceremony, which is at the same time a protection. It took place in the presence of at least 4 aged and respectable witnesses, and there were always many people there to watch the final settlement. The future slave received his price, which at this period was usually 1 load of guaxli, that is, 20 pieces of cloth. He remained at liberty so long as he had not spent it all, and this was generally a year or a little over, which is one of the few exact figures that we have for the cost of living in Tenochtitlan. When everything was gone, he gave himself up to his master and began his servitude. Another form of slavery arose from the indebtedness that one or more families might contract with a private person or a dignitary. A poor family might sell one of his sons as a slave and replace him by another child when he reached a marriageable age. Or again, in a time of famine, the wretched starving people might engage themselves to perform certain services in perpetuity for a master and his heirs, sowing, harvesting, sweeping the house, or carrying the wood. 4 or 5 families would join to provide a slave for these duties. He would undertake them for some years and then be replaced by some other member of the same families. The master plan paid an additional 3 or 4 guaxli at each replacement and gave some aids. This was a very old custom, and it was called huehuetlacoli, the old servitude. Its disadvantage was that in exchange for a single sum paid once and for all, and a few small supplementary payments, it was brought into being a compulsory and permanent liability. For this reason, it was done away with in 1505, at the time of the Great Famine, by Nesahuapili, and the abolition appears to have become general over the whole of the empire. At the time of the Spanish conquest, a family would still provide one of its members as a slave in payment of a debt. If the slave happened to die, the debt was cancelled. These slaves, therefore, were unusually well treated. The sale of the slave was also strictly regulated. Generally speaking, a master did not sell his slaves. If he became poor, he would send them off to trade on his account between Mexico and some more or less distant village. In order to do this, the slaves moved about quite freely. It was only the idle and vicious slave who could be sold, and even then it was necessary to have admonished solemnly him 3 times before witness in order to record his dishonesty or his refusal to work. If he did not improve, his master had the right to put a heavy wooden collar on his neck and lead him to the market to be sold. When 3 successive masters had been obligated to get rid of him, the slave faced the most shocking fate possible to his condition. From that moment he could be brought to be sacrificed. The Posteca and the artisans, who could not capture prisoners of war, provided themselves with victims in this way. Sahagún describes these sad processions of slaves plodding dully along the road to their death, ritually bathed, luxuriously dressed and adorned, stupefied by the divine teoctli that they had drunk, to end their lives on the stone in front of the statue of Huitzilopochtli. Yet they did not rebel. This manner of death seemed not only normal and inevitable to the ancient Mexicans, since those who were born under certain sages were foredoomed to such a fate, but even honorable. These slaves, plumed and ornamented on the point of death, were the physical reflection of the gods. They were gods. Their wretched outcast lives finish in apotheosis. But in fact there was little chance of a slave dying thus. The great majority of slaves, it seems, either managed to free themselves, even if it were only at their master's death, or else lived a life that was at least without danger and beyond the reach of misery. They were above all people who had escaped from their responsibilities, who had given up the rights and the duties of freedom. No military service, no taxes, no corvées, no duties toward the state or the district. I say it again, they were well treated. Furthermore, they were held to be under the protection of Tezcatlipoca, his well-beloved children. The sign Semiquisli was sacred to the great god, and on this date the slaves were given presents, and no one presumed to reproach them for fear of being brought to slavery by the wrath of Tezcatlipoca. The masters of the slaves gave strict orders to the whole household not to vex a slave in any way. It was said that if anyone reproached a slave on one of those days, he would bring poverty onto himself, and sickness and misfortune, and deserve to fall into slavery for having misused a well-beloved son of Tezcatlipoca. And if it happened that a slave freed himself and grew rich, and that the slave owner became in his turn a slave, it was said that this was the will of Tezcatlipoca, who had heard these slaves' prayer and had pity on him, and had punished the master for his hardness to his servants. In this way, beliefs, laws, and customs all joined to protect the slave, to make his condition easier, and to increase his chances of emancipation. At the beginning of the 16th century, the number of Tlacotli seems to have been increasing, a phenomenon which is explained by the greater tribute, the growth of trade to distant parts, and the difference between standards of living. In a complex society whose ancient organization had almost completely crumbled away, the rise of some to power and wealth had as its counterpart the depression of others. The very poor and the misfits sank, as it were, to the lowest level, beneath which there was nothing. Yet it is only justice to repeat once more that even this bottommost state was not without its hope. Wealth and poverty, the standards of living. In the Codex Telleriano-Remensis, wealth is symbolized by a wickerwork chest, betlacali, filled with green stones, and indeed the idea of material possessions tended more and more to take the manageable form of pieces of jade, gold, or cloth. Personal estate, as we should say now, was taking the place of real estate. It is nonetheless true, however, that in the eyes of the ruling class in the 16th century land, arable land still remained the basis of all wealth. As a dignitary rose rank by rank, so he acquired rights over a larger and larger area of real estate. In theory, no one was the owner of a piece of ground. The land belonged collectively either to the capuli, or to the public institutions, such as temples, or to the city itself. There was no private ownership of land, but a collective ownership with individual rights of user. These lands, says Zerita, referring to those of the district, are not of the private possession of each member of the district, but the common possession of the capuli, and the individual cannot dispose of them, but he enjoys them for his lifetime, and he can leave them to his sons and his heirs. It is unclear that what we are concerned with is a heritable usufruct. The register of the land and its distribution was kept up to date by the chief of the capuli. He and the elders saw to it that each family was allowed the plot that it needed. If a man did not cultivate his peace for 2 years running, he was severely admonished. If he took no notice of this, the next year he was deprived of his right, and the land that had been his returned to the common stock. The same happened when a family left the district or died out. The capuli's proprietorship covered all the land within its boundaries, even that which was not cultivated. There was no indeterminate ground, nothing without an owner. The chief and his council could let land to men who were not members of his district, but the rent was paid into the communal purse and not to a private person. But although the ownership was collective, the usufruct was individual. Every adult married man had the right and the indefeasible right to be given a plot and to work it. He was inscribed on the rolls at the moment of his marriage, and if he had not already inherited the right of working his father's land, the capuli was obliged to provide him with a piece, and at his death he left his children not the piece of land, but the right of farming it. Such was the primeval law of the Mexican city, the law of the democratic tribe. Every free man was provided with a piece of land and was required to work it. In time, and as the differentiation of social function increased, many exceptions to the ancient rule came into being. The dignitaries, the officials, and the priests did not cultivate the fields to which they had a right. The traders and the artisans were excused manual labor. Moreover, arable land was exceedingly rare in Mexico, on the islets of the lake, and it was only on the shores that the Mazahualtin could have their patches allotted to them. Many Mexicans led an entirely urban existence. It must be conceded, however, that the cases in which a family had its land taken from it were quite rare. The same maize field, the same market garden stayed from generation to generation in the hands of the same family. No doubt the capuli retained the ownership, but in practice, the citizen who followed his father and his grandfather in the same holding really felt himself at home. At the time immediately before the Spanish invasion, it appears that the sale of land was provided for by law. Arising from the traditional collective ownership, private property was in the act of coming into existence. This development is all the clearer if one takes the possessions of the other communities and cities rather than those of the capuli. The growth of the sovereign's power and the conquest of the Mexica and their allies are the two related bases for the evolution, for they brought into being a wide variety of land holdings with differing regulations. Altepetlali, belonging to a town; Tecpantlali, or lands set aside for the palace; Tlatocamili, or fields of the military command; Yaoyotlali, the fields of war. In all these cases, we are concerned with estates that were cultivated either by slaves or by the plebeians of a subjected city, and whose produce was devoted to the needs of the republic. The Indians of the valley of Toluca, for example, cultivated a field 1,600 yards long and 800 wide on behalf of the Mexican emperor. Thus, an important stock of land was at the disposal of the emperor and his allied kings, and they could allocate the income to either a temple or as pay to an official, a judge, or an officer. In a society that did not have money, pay consisted essentially of the income from a piece of land. There are a great many examples of estates being given to warriors as a reward for their achievements. At the time of which we are speaking, an important development was beginning to make itself apparent. For although in theory property was still communal, in fact, the land that had been attributed by way of life interest to a tacutli was transmitted by him to his heirs. These estates became pilali, land belonging to pili, that is to say that the sons of dignitaries who already by their birth had a kind of right to be preferred in the higher appointments were also allowed the advantage of inherited revenues. A private domain was building itself up at the expense of the public domain. It would be an exaggeration to say that the emperor and the dignitaries were great landed proprietors, for in fact an overriding law of communal possession was felt to exist, but it would be equally mistaken to assert that this law alone was recognized in practice. At this time, Aztec society was in a state of flux, of transition, and the taking of land into private hands was continually coming, as it were, to the surface. The customs and practices of real life grew more and more unlike those of tradition. For whereas the old established one general standard for all by the sharing of communal land, inequality in landed wealth had in fact become the rule. While the Masawali made the best of his plot, the high officials enjoyed important possessions in several provinces, following the example of the emperor, who owned country houses and pleasure gardens in many places. This inequality was no less striking in what may be termed liquid wealth. Although there was no money, certain commodities, goods, or objects ordinarily served as measures of value and as a means of exchange. The guashli, or length of cloth, with its multiple load, 20 lengths. The cocoa nib, the small change of the Aztecs, with its multiple, the shiquipili, a bag holding or supposed to hold 8,000 of them. Little T-shaped copper hatchets and quills filled with gold dust. Apart from these exchange goods, the treasure of the emperor or a private person consisted of an immense variety of agricultural products such as maize, beans, oilseeds, many-colored feathers, precious and semi-precious stones, jewels, clothes, ornaments, etc. This wealth was derived from two sources, tribute or tax, and commerce. And it is at this point that the traders come upon the scene. The whole population of the city and the empire paid taxes, except dignitaries, priests, bili, children, orphans, paupers, and naturally, the slaves. The Mexican Masahualtin paid principally in work, the traders and the artisans in commodities or the goods of their trade, and they paid every 20 or every 80 days. The tribute that each city or village was obliged to pay varied widely to the circumstances in which it had been incorporated into the empire and according to local resources. According to the Indian conception of it, the original institution of tribute was based upon a true contract, a contract of redemption. The conqueror had unlimited rights over the conquered, but the victorious city agreed to give up some of them in exchange for a solemn undertaking. After the fighting, very hard bargaining would begin. The defeated would try to come up as lightly as possible, while the Mexicans would threaten the renewal of hostilities. In the end, they would come to an agreement, and the victors would never fail to record the adversaries' enforced submission in due form. Do not come to us later on and complain that we require too much of you, since now you agree with it, was the sense of the observations that one finds in the native histories. Each province, and within each province, each city or town, had to supply a certain quantity of objects or produce once or twice a year, and the lists given in the Codex Mendoza showed how varied these contributions were. One province of the cold country, Xilotepec, had a yearly tax of 800 loads of women's clothes, that is 16,000 articles, 816 loads of men's loin cloths, 800 loads of embroidered skirts, 3,216 loads of guashli, 2 suits for warriors with their headgear and their shields, 4 large baskets of maize and other grain, and lastly 1 to 4 live eagles. The province of Tochpan, on the shores of the Gulf, had to furnish 6,948 loads of cloaks of different kinds, 800 loads of loincloths and 800 of skirts, 800 loads of peppers, 20 sacks of feathers, 2 jade necklaces, 1 turquoise necklace, 2 turquoise mosaic discs, 2 sumptuous costumes for the military chiefs. Tochtepec, which was the traders' headquarters on the frontiers of the southern and the eastern countries, paid, besides a great many clothes, 16,000 balls of rubber, 24,000 bunches of parrots' feathers, 80 packets of quetzal plumes, 1 shield, 1 diadem, 1 gold headband, and 2 gold necklaces, amber and crystal jewels, and cocoa. The tribute lists mention cotton and agave fiber cloth, clothes of all kinds, maize, grain, cocoa, honey, salt, peppers, tobacco, building materials, furniture, crockery, gold from the Mixtec provinces, turquoises and jade from the eastern coast, cochineal, incense, rubber, paper from the Guanahuac and Huastepec, shells from Ciutlan, live birds from Xilotepec, and from Oxitipan. In Guashli alone, the tribute brought in more than 100,000 loads every year. Now, as it had been shown, a load of guashli was reckoned to be the equivalent of a year's living for one person. It was therefore 100,000 yearly livings that came into Mexico in this one form, without speaking of all the other products mentioned above. For example, The tribute brought 32,000 large sheets of paper into the capital, 152,320 loincloths, 30,884 bundles of precious feathers, etc. No doubt, a certain proportion of this wealth was shared out among the districts of the capital, which, however, did not, at least in theory, take more than 2/5 of the levy, 2/5 being reserved for Texcoco and 1/5 for Tlacopan. But it is quite sure that the emperor and his chief dignitaries took the lion's share. After the fall of Cuetlaxtlan, Moctezuma I, his deputy Tlaca Eleutzin, and the leader of the expedition allotted themselves 3/4 of the tribute raised from this province. Only a quarter continued its journey towards the districts, and no one can tell what trifling share actually reached the common people. Considering the size of these figures, it is natural to suppose that the taxation was very heavy, and this was certainly the impression that the Spaniards received on their arrival when they heard the complaints and the protests of the Totonacs. But this tribe had been quite recently subjected, and it hated the Mexicans. Perhaps its evidence is not to be taken as literally true. One must also remember that some provinces were very densely populated. Alonso de Zurita, an excellent Spanish official and a most accurate observer, particularly states that in all this there was a great deal of regularity and of attentiveness to see that no one person was more heavily burdened than the rest. Each man paid little, and as there were many men, it was possible to bring together great quantities of goods with little work and no vexation. The towns and the villages of the Valley of Mexico were assessed in a manner peculiar to themselves. They were required, each in turn, to see to the upkeep of the palaces of the 3 allied sovereigns, and to supply them with domestic servants and provisions. Nezahualcóyotl, the king of Texcoco, had divided the country surrounding his capital into 8 districts, each of which was obliged to perform these duties for a given period each year, under the supervision of a capisqui. If Ixtlilxochitl is to be believed, that the amount that these districts had to provide was a very great indeed. A royal household would consume no fewer than 100 turkeys daily. It is certain that the rulers and those close to them were able to amass huge quantities of goods from the great inflow of wealth into Mexico and the allied cities which resulted from the tribute. It is equally sure that their expenses were enormous. Both Nezahualcóyotl at Texcoco, with his immense harem and his 40 favorite wives, of whom one alone, the daughter of the Mexican Emperor Axayacatl, had more than 2,000 people in her service, and Moctezuma II at Mexico, who was perpetually surrounded by 3,000 attendants in the palace, without counting the eagles, snakes, and jaguars, which he kept in special quarters, and which ate 500 turkeys a day, lived like potentates in the midst of an abundance from which an ever-increasing train of followers grew rich. But on the other hand, as there was no distinction between the public treasury and the sovereign's private fortune, it was he who gave out food and drink to the whole population during the month Tecuihuit, the time of the gap between the harvests when the family stocks were exhausted, and he who emptied his granaries in time of famine and disaster, and he who took upon himself the cost of war, the equipment, and the victualling of the troops. And the expenses of each dignitary in his degree had to cover not only his own living, but that of his followers, as well as the reception of travelers and the feeding of poor people. The wealth of the powerful blossomed out in luxury, but to a large extent the obligations of their office brought about its redistribution. This was not the case with the traders. As we have seen, the Posteca made no display of their wealth, except on the rare occasions when custom and propriety required them to be generous hosts. They had no position to keep up, and they did not redistribute their fortune. This wealth was derived neither from land nor from the taxes, but from trade, of which they had the monopoly. It piled up, carefully concealed in their warehouses, in the form of bundles of precious feathers, chests of green stones and amber, calabashes filled with gold dust. Whereas the ruling class spent lavishly, the Posteca, leaving their comfortable but unspectacular lives, did not have to provide for any needs but their own. They were not called upon to help the common people or the poor, and they were able to accumulate what one now terms capital. The dignitaries, after all, were only high officials who received important grants or salaries, but who were obliged to spend by far the greater part merely because of their position. But of the traders, on the other hand, formed the primary nucleus of a wealthy class whose fortune was essentially personal. In the Aztec society of the beginning of the 16th century, many widely differing standards of living were to be found. The brilliant luxury of the sovereign, and that of the dignitaries in their various degrees, the middle-class comfort of the traders, and the frugality of the common people. The poor are too often mentioned in literature for it to be possible to ignore their importance. The happy mediocrity, which had been the lot of all Mexicans 2 centuries earlier, was vanishing little by little, as the tribal village grew into the capital of an empire and became the center towards which all the wealth of a vast country converged. Urban life, the increasing complexity of functions, the increase of the dominions, and the accompanying task of administration, and the emergence of commerce all ineluctably and irredeemably changed the ancient ways. No doubt the Capuli with its democratic organization must have acted as a powerful stabilizer, but it is equally probable that the little plot of ground that has seemed quite enough to the plain citizen of the 14th century appeared wretchedly meager to the man of the 16th. For here, too, an evolution was beginning, whose development we can only imagine, seeing that it was savagely broken by the European invasion. The sovereign, the great dignitaries, the council. At the summit, at once the leader in war and the giver of rewards, the representative of the privileged classes and the protector of the common people, the sovereign upheld the rule of the governing class, alternately conciliating and repressing that of the merchants. He was attended by all the outward show of monarchical power, and this show corresponded exactly to the reality. Nothing is more futile than the attempts of certain modern authors to deny the evidence of this. Although the conquistadores may have been uncultivated men, they were excellent observers, and their descriptions are clear. Besides, they agree with the native sources, which carefully trace back the genealogy, the coronation, and the death of each ruler. One is compelled to recognize the fact that the Mexican city of 1519 was a monarchy, but it remains to be decided what kind of a monarchy it was. Who was the monarch, and how was he appointed? The Mexican, whom we call the emperor, was there entitled the Tlatoani, he who speaks, from the verb tlatoa, to speak. The same root is found in the words relating to speech, for example, tlatoli, language, and to the power or authority, such as tlatocayot, or state. And the two senses come together in the word tlatocan, which means the supreme council, the speaking place and the place from which power emanates. The name Tlatoani was not given to the ruler by mere chance, for the basis of his power was the art of speaking well in the discussions in council, and of making with ease and dignity those high-flown figurative speeches that the Aztecs liked so much. His other title was that of Tlacatecutli, chief of the warriors, which referred to a very important aspect of his office. He was the commander-in-chief of the armies of the 3 confederated cities. The origins of the Mexican dynasty are obscure, and this obscurity was rendered darker by the attempts of the Aztec chroniclers at supplying their ruling house with a noble pedigree. They felt obliged to make it appear that the dynasty descended from the great and legendary Toltec kings, although it was in reality a house that had come but lately on the scene. This end was reached by taking a turn to Colhuacan, the lake city of the south, where the customs and the language of Tula had persisted. It was quite essential that the first Aztec emperor, Acamapichli, should be a native of this town, and thus a Toltec. And in order to prove it, there were a great many complicated accounts of his rise of power. One of these versions, a particularly interesting one in that it was drawn up after the Spanish conquest by order of the conquistador Juan Cano, who had married Doña Isabel, the daughter of Moctezuma II, no doubt gives us the official story. This relacion expressly states that the lords of Colhuacan descended from Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent, king of Tula, and that Acamapichli was the adopted son of the last legitimate lord of this family. According to another source, Acamapichli was born at Colhuacan, although his mother was a Mexican. But another woman plays a very important, though somewhat obscure, role in the founding of the dynasty. Sometimes she appears as the young king's mother by adoption, sometimes as his wife, but always as a señora of the great Colhuacan family. There is more than one pointer to show that in the former times, both nobility and power were inherited through women. But however that may be, the link by which they tried to join the Mexican royal family to a glorious and mythical past was an exceedingly frail one. After Acamapichli, the turquoise diadem stayed in the family without a break until the end. The second emperor, Huitzilopochtli, was his son, and the third, Chimalpopoca, his grandson. After that, the power was often inherited by the brother of the late sovereign, or his nephew. The different sources do not always agree as to the exact relationship between the successive emperors, but one point remains upon which there is no possible doubt. The descent is always in one family. It is one single dynasty. Custom could vary from one town to another. At Texcoco, for example, there was a regular father-to-son descent, but it was still necessary to decide which son should have the throne, and this was not easy in the case of polygamous rulers. It was conceded that one of the king's wives was the legitimate wife, and in theory it was her eldest son who succeeded his father. Yet there was still a considerable amount of room for uncertainty, for as Zarita says, if none of his sons or grandsons was fit to rule, no successor was proclaimed, but the chief lords set about electing one. For this reason, Nasahuacoyot, before his death, took the precaution of appointing his 7-year-old son Nasahuapili as his successor, and having him acknowledged king, in the same way that the Roman and Byzantine empires made their sons associates in the empire to assure them of the crown. At Mexico, election was customary. Acamapichtli did not name his successor at the time of his death, but left the republic the task of electing whoever appeared most fit. This custom has always been preserved among the Mexicans. The sons of the kings have not ruled by right of inheritance, but by election. In the beginning it was the whole nation, or at least the heads of families, who appointed the sovereign. The city was still small, and the inhabitants few. They could all be brought together in the central square to ratify the suggestions of the leaders by acclamation. As the city and the empire grew larger, so the body that elected the sovereign grew smaller. It was not the people, but the Senate who named Ahuitzot. At the beginning of the 16th century, the Electoral College was composed of about 100 persons, divided into 5 categories. The Tecutla Toque, or supreme dignitaries, who numbered 13. The Achkawatin, officials of the second rank who represented, or who were supposed to represent, the various districts. 2 military categories, the one serving and the other retired. And then the most important priests, the Tlemacacasque. As it will be seen, this college represented only the higher level of the ruling class of officials, priests, and warriors. Not only were the slaves excluded, of course, and not only the people, but the traders, the craftsmen, and even the nobles, the pili. The election of the emperor was, therefore, in the hands of a narrow oligarchy. Sahagun states that there was no poll. It is the same even now in the Nahuatl villages of Mexico, when a municipal head or the head of a confraternity is to be chosen. The electors discuss it among themselves, suggestions are put up, and they agree upon a name. There is no voting, no ballot, as we understand it. When he was proclaimed, the new sovereign had to go through the long and trying ceremonies of the coronation. In the course of them, he was obliged to do penance before the gods, listen to many harangues, and replied to them by eloquent speeches. Finally, he addressed the people, exhorting them above all to venerate the gods and flee drunkenness. He then appeared in all the splendor of the imperial robes, with a triangular diadem of gold and turquoises on his forehead, wearing a blue-green cloak and jewels of green stones, and carrying a scepter in the form of a serpent in his hand. The speeches exchanged between the newly elected emperor and the chiefs, and his address to the people, give an idea of the Mexican conception of the sovereign dignity. He had undoubtedly been chosen by the magnates, but his official theory was that he had rarely been appointed by the gods, especially by Tezcatlipoca, he who sees all in his magic mirror, and therefore his first duties were towards them. He thanked them for having selected him, though at the same time he complained, sighing at the weight of such a burden as the government of the empire. He would defend the temple of Huitzilopochtli, and ensure the gods the worship that was their due. His remaining duties were towards the people. He was traditionally known as the father and mother of the Mexicans. He owed them justice, and he was to struggle for them against famine, so that they might have an abundance of the fruits of the earth. The fundamental idea of the Aztec monarchy, as they show through the stereotyped official formulae, are not without dignity. There is a sense of the public good, and the feeling of a real unity between the rulers and the ruled. Furthermore, everything goes to show that the emperors took their duties seriously. Reign after reign, they are to be found in the traditional histories, zealous not only in increasing the empire and building temples, but also in coming to the help of the unfortunate. There is Moctezuma I, for example, distributing food and clothing to the entire population, or Ahuitzotl sharing out 200,000 loads of maize among the victims of the flood. The great dignitaries, who were often the closest relatives of the emperor, collaborated with him in the government, and the first among them, who had the curious title of Siwakawat, women servant, was a real vice-emperor. His title was the name of a great goddess, and it is likely that in the beginning the Siwakawat was no more than her chief priest. It is only in the reign of Moctezuma I that the title of Siwakawat, which is found earlier in Mexico and other cities, suddenly became that of the first dignitary of the state after the sovereign. "You will help me to rule this Mexican republic," said Moctezuma I to his brother Tlacaeltzin, whom he had named Siwakawat. This great dignitary had the widest powers. He was the supreme judge in marital and common law, and he had the duty of providing for the requirements of governmental business and the royal finances. He heard cases which were submitted to him on appeal, says Torquemada, who describes him as the high presiding judge. It was he who named the warriors who were to be rewarded. It was he who organized the military expeditions and appointed their commanders. He convened the electoral college at the sovereign's death, and during the interregnum he acted as head of state. When the emperor left Tenochtitlan to command the troops of the Confederacy in person, the Siwakawat moved into the palace and replaced him in his absence. The honors that were paid him were second only to the emperors, and he alone might appear before the sovereign without taking off his shoes. He received a very considerable share of the tribute from the conquered cities. He was the Tlatoani's understudy in everything, and as a symbol of power, his black and white cloak came immediately after the blue-green. It seems that the action of Moctezuma I in setting his brother Tlacaeltzin beside him was a stroke of genius. He had a vigorous personality, and the chroniclers always admire him. Jimalpahin, for example, described him as Ue Okishli, which is exactly rendered by Vir Illustris. All testimonies agreed in extolling his military worth, his statesmanship, and his loyalty to the emperor. The office acquired such luster under him that all those who followed him in it were chosen from his direct descendants, his sons and his grandsons, to the very last of them, Tlacotzin, who lived long enough to lay the submission of Mexico at the feet of Cortez on August 13, 1521, and to be baptized under the name of Don Juan Velázquez. Beneath the Siwakawat, there were four great military dignitaries who, with him, were the emperor's chief counselors. Two of them, the Tlacochcalcat and the Tlacatecat, were often directly related to the sovereign, and it was between them that his successor was chosen. Moctezuma II, for example, had the office of Tlacochcalcat in the reign of his father, Ahuitzotl. Some of these dignitaries also had judicial powers. The Tlacatecat had cognizance of civil and criminal cases, an appeal lay from him to the Siwakawat. And then the Indian and Spanish history speak of a fairly large number of titles which cannot, in the present state of knowledge, be defined in terms of their function. For example, we know that in his youth the Emperor Tizoc had the office of Tlayotlak, a word which means a foreign tribe and which may have been used for a title, as Germanicus or Parthicus was used among the Romans. The Mexicat Acautli, the chief of the officials of the city of Mexico, was one of those who had the terrible responsibility of the final surrender. The Tecutlamacazqui, who was often mentioned among the immediate advisors of the emperor, appears to have been the representative of the priestly order before the central authority. The Betlacalcat, he who was in charge of the chest, took care of the granaries and stores in which the tribute of the provinces was kept, and the Huaycapixqui had the functions of both the prefect of the capital and of chief director of the empire's tax gatherers. In this connection, it seems that plurality of offices was not uncommon. Thus, the Tlacochcalcat, Itzcoatzin, who was serving when the Spaniards arrived, was at the same time governor of Tlatelolco. Apart from the Betlacalcat and the Huaycapixqui, perhaps because of the purely civilian nature of their duties, the great dignitaries were members of the Tlatocan, or Supreme Council of the city. The emperor presided over it. or if he were not there, the Siwakwat. And this council was consulted before all important decisions, embassies, declarations of war, etc. It also formed the principal nucleus of the college that chose the sovereign. This being the case, it would be observed to see it in the equivalent of one of our deliberative assemblies, or even a council of sachems in a North American Indian tribe. In the beginning, no doubt, it was made up of delegates elected by the different kapuli, but at this period at least, part of it was composed of the emperor's nominees, and the rest were co-opted. Here again we have an instance of the change of tribal democracy to an oligarchic regime, whose guardian and whose chief was the emperor. But it must not be forgotten that the plebeians could reach the highest honors. Although this aristocracy was jealous of its prerogatives, it was not ossified. It could still renew and strengthen itself by recruiting new men of value. But it is to be observed that although the plebeian might hope to become a tekutli, a trader might not. A man born to trade remained all his life a merchant. In modern terms, it could be said that the aristocracy had its origin in the people and not in the bourgeoisie. The Mexican city-state of the 16th century, a complex social and political organism, was profoundly different from the wandering tribe which, in 1325, had pitched upon a few islets in the reeds as a refuge. And the difference was not merely quantitative, concerned with the increase of population, territory, and resources, but qualitative. The city was not merely the tribe enlarged. It had become something else, a state launched upon a career of aggrandizement, a society in which differentiation was continually growing, and which enmity between the classes was beginning to appear, in which the nature of ownership was changing, and in which the ideas of public service and of personal wealth were coming into hidden conflict. But religion, the wonderfully powerful cement binding the various elements of this society, obscured in its complexity and with its living, dominating and unquestioned power, imposed a single vision of the world upon the whole community, and by its rights regulated the life of each of its members. It was by religion that the city and the tribe were one, and by religion that variety was unified. It was religion that gave this town, so strangely modern in many ways, its medieval face. For the life of the Mexican, within his social and material compass, makes sense only if one perceives the degree to which an all-powerful religion told him his duty, ruled his days, colored his view of the universe and of his personal destiny. This concludes Chapter 2.